You've seen toxic mothers-in-law, but absolutely nothing compares to the chilling cruelty of Lady Eleanor Montgomery. On the most important day of a young woman's life, she looked her new daughter-in-law in the eye and banished her to the basement kitchen to eat dinner with the scullery maids. The bride sat weeping into her white gown, utterly broken. But Eleanor made one fatal miscalculation. She didn't know who was about to walk through those estate doors. Let's dive into a wedding day revenge that will leave you absolutely breathless. The Montgomery family did not just have money, they had empires. Their wealth was the kind that bought silence, altered laws, and commanded the absolute submission of everyone in their orbit. At the absolute center of this terrifying dynasty was Lady Eleanor Montgomery, a matriarch whose veins practically ran with liquid ice. She possessed a terrifying calculating intelligence and a belief that her family's bloodline was as close to divine as one could get without a crown. Enter Beatrice Turner. Beatrice was not born into wealth. She was a brilliant, hard-working horticulturist who spent her days with dirt under her fingernails, restoring historical landscapes and coaxing rare orchids back to life. She was entirely self-made, having paid her way through university after the tragic passing of her mother when Beatrice was just a teenager. She was warm, fiercely intelligent, and profoundly genuine, everything the high society, based off of London, actively despised. She met Nathaniel Montgomery, Eleanor's only son and the sole heir to the Montgomery fortune, at the Royal Botanical Gardens. Nathaniel had been sent there on a tedious public relations assignment for his family's corporate foundation. He was captivated immediately. Beatrice didn't know who he was, and for the first time in his life, a woman looked at him and saw just a man, not a bank account. Their romance was a whirlwind of secret escapes and quiet moments shielded from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi and the watchful, hawkish eyes of his mother, but secrets in that world never last. When Nathaniel finally brought Beatrice to the sprawling Montgomery estate, a gargantuan, intimidating fortress of limestone and manicured hedges known as Highfield Manor, the true nightmare began. From the moment Beatrice stepped through the towering mahogany doors, Lady Eleanor launched a covert war. Eleanor had spent decades grooming Penelope Wentworth, a terrifyingly snobbish heiress of a rival shipping conglomerate, to be Nathaniel's bride. In Eleanor's eyes, Beatrice was a parasite, a common weed trying to root herself in a manicured royal garden. The engagement dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Lady Eleanor invited 30 of the wealthiest aristocrats in Europe. She purposefully sat Beatrice at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 elderly dukes who spoke only French, knowing full well Beatrice couldn't speak a word of it. When it came time for speeches, Eleanor raised her crystal champagne flute and smiled with a predator's grace. "To my darling Nathaniel," Eleanor purred, her voice echoing through the vaulted dining room, "who has always possessed such a charitable heart, even now taking in those less fortunate, trying to elevate them from the dirt. It is a testament to his pity. I mean his compassion." The table erupted in polite, muffled laughter. Beatrice felt her face burn, her hands trembling under the heavy silk tablecloth. Nathaniel stood up, his jaw clenched, and firmly took Beatrice's hand, cutting his mother off and announcing their engagement right then and there. It was supposed to be a victory, but as Beatrice looked at Lady Eleanor, she didn't see a defeated woman. She saw a general drawing up battle plans. Over the next 10 months, wedding planning became a psychological battlefield. Eleanor seized control of the finances, the guest list, and the venue under the guise of protecting the family's image. Beatrice's modest romantic ideas were systematically bulldozed. Beatrice wanted a small church ceremony. Eleanor booked a massive, echoing cathedral. Beatrice wanted a simple silk gown. Eleanor forced her into a heavy, restrictive, jewel-encrusted monstrosity that felt more like a suit of armor than a wedding dress. Every single day, Eleanor found a way to remind Beatrice that she was nothing, a nobody, a temporary plaything that the family was forced to tolerate. "Do not mistake a marriage certificate for an initiation, my dear," Eleanor whispered to Beatrice one afternoon in the drawing room, sipping her Earl Grey tea. You may wear my son's ring, but you will never be one of us. You are a guest in this world, and guests can be asked to leave. Beatrice endured it all because she loved Nathaniel. She believed that once the wedding was over, they would move to their own home, away from the suffocating grip of the matriarch. She thought the wedding day would be the finish line. She had no idea it was actually the execution. The day of the wedding was gray and bitterly cold, the kind of biting chill that seeped into your bones. The ceremony was a blur of flashing cameras, stiff smiles, and suffocating tension. 500 guests packed the cathedral, their eyes judging Beatrice's every breath. As Beatrice and Nathaniel said their vows, Eleanor sat in the front row, wearing a dress that was entirely insultingly white. But it wasn't until the reception at Highfield Manor that Eleanor's ultimate trap was sprung. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a glittering palace of gold leaf and towering white roses. Thousands of candles flickered, reflecting off the diamond necklaces of the billionaires and aristocrats mingling on the marble floor. As the newly married couple arrived, Nathaniel was immediately ambushed. His uncle, Lord Rowan, a man heavily indebted to Eleanor, grabbed Nathaniel by the shoulder, insisting on an urgent, highly classified meeting in the estate's West Wing regarding an emergency with the family's overseas accounts. Nathaniel protested, but Rowan flanked him with 2 massive security guards. "I'll be back in 5 minutes, my love," Nathaniel promised, kissing Beatrice's forehead. "Go to the head table. I'll be right there." Beatrice, exhausted and overwhelmed by the heavy dress, nodded and made her way through the sea of staring guests toward the raised dais where the bridal party was seated. But as she approached the long, cascading table, she froze. There were 12 chairs. Lady Eleanor sat dead center. To her right was Lord Rowan's empty chair. To her left sat Penelope Wentworth, laughing loudly. There was no seat for the bride. Confused, Beatrice approached Eleanor. "Excuse me, Eleanor, I believe my seat is missing." The music in the room seemed to dip. The guests at the nearby tables turned their heads, their eyes gleaming with hungry anticipation. Lady Eleanor slowly set down her silver fork and dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. She looked up at Beatrice with a smile that could freeze boiling water. "Missing?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding elite could hear. "Oh no, darling, there is no mistake. This table is reserved for the family, the true family." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. "I am Nathaniel's wife. I am your family now." Eleanor let out a soft, patronizing chuckle, and Penelope Wentworth joined in, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. "A piece of paper does not rewrite a bloodline, Beatrice," Eleanor said sweetly, her eyes locked onto the young bride. "You come from the working class. You come from the dirt. We wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable among your betters on your very first day. We've arranged a seat for you where you will feel much more at home, with the people who share your pedigree." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous hiss. "You will go down to the basement. You will eat your wedding dinner in the servants' kitchen. If you cause a scene, if you shed a single tear, I will ensure the press destroys you tomorrow. I will make sure Nathaniel's entire fortune is frozen, and I will ruin that little garden center you love so much. Turn around, walk away, know your place." Beatrice looked around frantically. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen. The surrounding guests, the so-called high society, simply watched her. Some smirked, some whispered. Not a single soul stepped forward to help her. They were all terrified of Eleanor, or worse, they agreed with her. Humiliated, choking back tears of pure shock and devastation, Beatrice turned around. With 500 sets of eyes burning into her back, the bride gathered the heavy skirts of her white gown and walked away from her own wedding feast. She pushed through the heavy oak doors that led to the service corridors. The transition was instant. From the glittering, perfumed ballroom, she descended into the harsh, fluorescent-lit, chaotic world of the estate's underbelly. She walked down the cold stone steps to the basement kitchens. The heat of the massive ovens hit her like a wall. Dozens of chefs, scullery maids, and waiters were running back and forth, shouting orders in French, and English, carrying silver platters of caviar and roasted pheasant. When the bride walked in, the entire kitchen ground to a dead, agonizing halt. Chef Girard, a stern, broad-shouldered man from Lyon, dropped his tongs. The maids gasped, covering their mouths. A bride on her wedding day, standing in the grease-stained kitchen, her eyes red and brimming with unshed tears. Madame Chef Girard whispered, stepping forward, his apron covered in flour. What has happened? Are you hurt?" Beatrice couldn't speak. She just shook her head, her chest heaving as a sob finally broke through her lips. She pointed to a small, scarred wooden table in the corner where the dishwashers usually ate their scraps. "Lady Eleanor," Beatrice choked out, her voice trembling. She said, "My seat is down here." A heavy, furious silence fell over the kitchen staff. They knew Lady Eleanor's cruelty. They lived it every day. But this was a level of pure, unadulterated evil that shocked even the most hardened staff members. Without a word, Chef Girard grabbed a clean linen cloth and draped it over the battered wooden table. A young scullery maid hurriedly pulled up a wooden stool, wiping it down furiously. Beatrice sat down, the heavy skirts of her designer gown spilling over the grease-stained floor tiles. She sat there, a bride in the basement, entirely broken. Chef Girard brought her a bowl of simple potato soup, the meal the staff was eating that night, and set it gently before her. "Eat, madame," he said softly, his eyes filled with immense sorrow. "You need your strength." Upstairs, the champagne popped. The music swelled. Eleanor had won. She had broken the commoner and put her in her place. But Lady Eleanor was about to learn a terrifying lesson about power. Because while Eleanor ruled Highfield Manor, she did not rule the country. 10 minutes passed. Beatrice stared into her bowl of soup, her tears falling silently into the broth. The kitchen staff moved around her with quiet, respectful reverence, occasionally shooting furious glares at the ceiling, wishing they could burn the ballroom down. Suddenly, the heavy service doors at the far end of the basement flew open with a violent crash. A breathless security guard, his face pale and slick with sweat, sprinted into the kitchen. He was practically hyperventilating. "Clear the corridors," he screamed to Chef Girard. "Lock down the loading docks. Move the vans right now." Chef Girard scowled. "What is the meaning of this? We are in the middle of service." "You don't understand," the guard yelled, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "The royal motorcade just breached the front gates. She's here. The Queen is here." The entire kitchen froze. The Queen Genevieve, the reigning monarch, was not on the guest list. She rarely attended private functions, let alone weddings. Her presence at an event was something that required months of protocol security sweeps and diplomatic planning. Above them in the grand ballroom, chaos was erupting. Lady Eleanor had been mid-sip of her champagne when the massive double doors of the ballroom were thrown open by 6 heavily armed royal guards in full ceremonial uniform. The orchestra abruptly stopped playing. The 500 guests fell utterly silent, their jaws dropping as they scrambled to stand and bow. Queen Genevieve, a woman of terrifying poise and legendary authority, stepped into the room. She was in her late 60s, dressed in an impeccably tailored emerald green coat, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She did not look happy. In fact, she looked furious. Lady Eleanor, trembling with a mixture of shock and desperate ecstasy, practically shoved Penelope Wentworth aside as she rushed toward the entrance, executing a deep, sweeping curtsy. "Your Majesty," Eleanor gasped, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face. "What an unimaginable honor. We had no idea you were coming. Please allow me to have the head table cleared for you immediately." Queen Genevieve ignored Eleanor completely. Her sharp, piercing blue eyes scanned the opulent room. She looked at the diamond chandeliers. She looked at the terrified aristocrats. She looked at the head table. "Where is she?" The Queen's voice cut through the silent ballroom like a steel blade. Eleanor blinked, her smile faltering. I beg your pardon, Your Majesty." "The bride," Queen Genevieve said coldly, taking a step closer to the matriarch. "Where is Beatrice?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. Panic flared in her chest. How did the Queen know Beatrice's name? Why was the reigning monarch asking for the commoner? "Oh, Beatrice is She is—" Eleanor stammered, her mind racing for a lie. "She felt terribly unwell, Your Majesty. The excitement of the day was simply too much for someone of her constitution. She's resting in the upstairs chambers, but please allow me to fetch Nathaniel." The Queen's eyes narrowed. "Do not lie to me, Eleanor. I have known you since you were a wretched, spiteful debutante. I know exactly what you are." Eleanor physically recoiled as if she had been slapped. The guests gasped collectively. Queen Genevieve turned to the commander of her royal guard. "Find her." Before the guards could even take a step, Nathaniel burst into the ballroom from the west wing, having finally shaken off his uncle. He stopped dead in his tracks, seeing the Queen of the realm standing in the center of his wedding reception. He bowed quickly, but his eyes frantically searched the room for his wife. "Nathaniel," the Queen said, her tone softening slightly. "Where is your wife?" I don't know," Nathaniel said, panic rising in his throat as he looked at the empty seat at the head table. He turned to his mother, his eyes blazing with sudden, furious realization. "Mother, what did you do?" Before Eleanor could answer, a young waiter, trembling uncontrollably, stepped forward from the shadows of the service doors. He bowed deeply to the Queen. "Your Majesty." The waiter whispered, his voice shaking. "The bride. Lady Eleanor sent her to the basement. She is in the kitchens." Nathaniel let out a sound of pure agony and rage, but before he could move, the Queen raised her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Stay here," Queen Genevieve commanded. She turned her icy glare back to Eleanor, who was now visibly shaking, the color completely drained from her face. "You will not move from this spot, Eleanor. Not a single one of you will move." With her guards flanked around her, the Queen of the realm turned her back on the billionaires and the aristocrats. She walked toward the service doors, her emerald coat sweeping behind her, and descended the cold stone steps into the basement. Down in the kitchen, Beatrice was still crying silently into her hands. The heavy doors opened, and Chef Girard and the rest of the staff immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the floor. Beatrice looked up, her tear-streaked face pale. She tried to stand, trying to gather the massive skirts of her ruined wedding dress to curtsy, but she stumbled on the hem. Queen Genevieve stepped forward and caught Beatrice gently by the shoulders, steadying her. The Queen looked around the hot, greasy kitchen. She looked at the scullery maids on their knees. She looked at the scarred wooden table. She looked at the bowl of potato soup. Then the Queen did something that would be talked about in the halls of high society for the next 100 years. Without a word, Queen Genevieve pulled up a second wooden stool. The most powerful woman in the country, a monarch whose wealth and bloodline dwarfed the Montgomerys by 1,000 miles, sat down at the dishwasher's table. She looked up at Chef Girard, who was still trembling on the floor. "Chef," the Queen said calmly, removing her silk gloves. "I have had a very long journey. Would you be so kind as to bring me a bowl of that soup? I believe I will be having my dinner down here tonight with the bride." The basement kitchen of Highfield Manor was a place of heat, grease, and deafening noise, but in the presence of Queen Genevieve, it had become as silent and reverent as a cathedral. The only sound was the soft clinking of the Queen's silver spoon against the chipped porcelain bowl. She ate the potato soup with the same dignified grace she would have employed at a state banquet. Her emerald coat, an intense splash of regal color against the dull, flour-dusted backdrop of the scullery. Beatrice sat entirely frozen on her wooden stool. Her mind was misfiring, unable to process the sheer surrealism of the moment. Across from her sat the reigning monarch, a woman whose face was minted on the currency, quietly sharing a meal designed for dishwashers. Chef Girard stood at attention near the massive ovens, his breath held tight in his chest, while the scullery maids remained kneeling on the grease-stained tiles, their eyes wide with disbelief. Finally, Queen Genevieve set her spoon down and dabbed her lips with a simple paper napkin. She looked at Beatrice, her piercing blue eyes softening into a gaze of profound, aching familiarity. "You have her eyes," the Queen whispered, her voice carrying a raw, emotional weight that stripped away the royal veneer. "I always wondered if you would inherit Margaret's eyes. They are exactly the same shade of amber, the kind of eyes that could look through the pomp and circumstance and see straight into the soul of a person." Beatrice's breath hitched. The heavy, jewel-encrusted bodice of her wedding gown felt suddenly tighter. You knew my mother." Queen Genevieve offered a sad, nostalgic smile. "Knew her, my dear Beatrice Margaret Lynwood, before she became Margaret Turner, was not just someone I knew. She was my anchor in a world that was determined to drag me under." The Queen motioned for her equerry, Lord Theodore Campbell, who had been standing guard by the service doors, to step back and give them privacy. He bowed and retreated into the shadows. "The world knew your mother as a brilliant horticulturist," the Queen began, her voice echoing softly against the brick walls. "But before she ever planted a single orchid in those botanical gardens, she was my dearest confidant. We met at boarding school in Switzerland. I was a terrified crown princess, suffocating under the crushing weight of my future duties, entirely isolated and surrounded by sycophants. Your mother was the only person who treated me like a human being. She didn't care about my title. She cared about me." Beatrice listened spellbound, the tears finally ceasing as the shock gave way to an overwhelming hunger for the truth. Her mother had never spoken of a royal connection, never once. "When I ascended to the throne," Queen Genevieve continued, her gaze drifting toward the flickering pilot light of the nearest stove, "I fell into a deep, agonizing depression. The crown is a heavy, isolating thing, Beatrice. I was drowning. It was your mother who pulled me back from the edge. She would sneak into the palace grounds past midnight, bringing me cuttings from the royal gardens, forcing me to put my hands in the soil, reminding me that life still grew. Even in the darkest of places, she saved my life. But why did she never tell me?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling. "Why did she live so modestly if she was your closest friend?" "Because she fell in love with your father," the Queen said softly. "A brilliant, kind-hearted school teacher with no title and no fortune. High society turned its vicious back on her. My own advisors threatened to cause a scandal if I associated with a woman who had disgraced her aristocratic lineage by marrying a commoner. Margaret, in her infinite wisdom and bravery, chose love over court life. She asked me to let her go, to let her live quietly in the world she had chosen. I respected her wishes, but I made her a promise on the day she left the palace." The Queen reached across the scarred wooden table and gently took Beatrice's trembling, dirt-smudged hands into her own. "I promised her that I would always watch over her bloodline." Queen Genevieve vowed, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "I kept my distance to honor her desire for a normal life for you, but I have watched you grow, Beatrice. I celebrated your university graduation from afar. I mourned with you from the shadows when Margaret passed away, and when my intelligence network informed me that you were engaged to Nathaniel Montgomery, and more concerningly, that you were about to become the daughter-in-law of Lady Eleanor. I knew I could no longer remain a silent observer." The Queen squeezed Beatrice's hands, her eyes flashing with a sudden, terrifying, protective fury. "Eleanor Montgomery is a viper." The Queen spat, the sheer disdain in her voice making Chef Gerard flinch in the background. "A petty, cruel woman who inherited her wealth and mistook it for worth. I was attending a diplomatic summit in Geneva when Lord Theodore informed me of Eleanor's machinations regarding this wedding. I expedited my return. I landed an hour ago. I came here today to ensure you were treated with the respect you deserve." The monarch looked around the grim, sweltering kitchen, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, absolute wrath. "And it seems my arrival was not a moment too soon." Beatrice looked down at her hands encased in the Queen's gentle grip. The crushing humiliation that had weighed her down just 20 minutes ago began to fracture. The intense isolation, the belief that she was entirely alone in a den of wolves, shattered completely. She wasn't just a commoner banished to the basement. She was the daughter of the Queen's savior. "What do we do now?" Beatrice whispered, looking up at the monarch. Queen Genevieve let go of Beatrice's hands and stood up. She smoothed the front of her emerald coat. The warmth and nostalgia vanished from her face, replaced by the terrifying cold majesty of a sovereign going to war. "Now," the Queen asked, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave. "Now, Beatrice, you are going to wipe your tears. Queens do not cry in front of those who wish them harm. And tonight, my dear, you are royalty. We are going upstairs, and we are going to teach Lady Eleanor Montgomery what true power looks like." The grand ballroom of Highfield Manor was locked in a state of suffocating, agonizing paralysis. 500 of the most powerful people in Europe stood frozen at their tables, their champagne flutes discarded, their meals untouched. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, unforgiving light on the terrified faces of the elite. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to sit. The air was thick with a palpable electric dread. At the head of the room, Lady Eleanor Montgomery looked as though she were physically shrinking. Her impeccably tailored white dress, the ultimate insult to the bride, now felt like a glaring target painted on her back. She was trembling so violently that her diamond earrings rattled. Beside her, Penelope Wentworth, the rival heiress who had laughed at Beatrice's banishment, had backed herself against the wall, desperately trying to blend into the floral arrangements. Standing in the dead center of the ballroom, surrounded by the towering, unmoving royal guards, was Nathaniel Montgomery. Nathaniel was a man possessed by blinding, apocalyptic rage. The realization of what his mother had done had hit him with the force of a freight train. He paced like a caged tiger, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Every time he looked at the empty seat at the head table, a fresh wave of nausea and fury washed over him. He had promised to protect Beatrice. He had sworn to shield her from his mother's venom, and the moment he had taken his eyes off her, Eleanor had struck. "Nathaniel, please," Eleanor croaked, her voice paper-thin, breaking the agonizing silence. "You must understand. I was only trying to protect the family's image. She simply doesn't belong here. I did what had to be done for your future." "Shut your mouth," Nathaniel roared, the sheer volume of his voice cracking like a whip through the vaulted room. Several aristocrats flinched. Eleanor recoiled, bringing a hand to her chest in shock. Nathaniel had never in his 30 years of life raised his voice at his mother. He had always been the dutiful son, navigating her toxic demands with polite diplomacy. But that man was dead. "You did not do this for my future," Nathaniel snarled, stepping closer to the dais, his eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it made Eleanor physically step back. "You did this for your ego. You did this because you cannot stand the thought of me loving a woman you cannot control. You banished my wife to a basement on her wedding day. You humiliated the only pure thing in my life." Before Eleanor could stutter out a defense, the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The silence in the room somehow deepened, transforming into a vacuum that sucked the oxygen from the air. Queen Genevieve entered the ballroom, but she was not alone. Arm in arm with the reigning monarch, walking with her head held high and her back completely straight, was Beatrice. The grease from the kitchen floor stained the hem of her $1,000,000 gown, and her makeup was slightly smudged from her earlier tears, but she moved with a newfound, terrifying dignity. The contrast was staggering: the elegant, terrifying queen in emerald and the battered but unbroken bride in white. The 500 guests bowed and curtsied in unison, a wave of diamonds and silk dropping toward the floor. Nathaniel let out a breathless gasp. He sprinted across the ballroom, completely ignoring royal protocol, and fell to his knees in front of Beatrice. He buried his face in her hands, his shoulders shaking with overwhelming relief and crushing guilt. "Beatrice, my love, I am so sorry," Nathaniel choked out, kissing her hands frantically. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. I should never have left your side." Beatrice looked down at her husband. She gently pulled her hands from his grasp and cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. "I know, Nathaniel. I know you didn't. Stand up." Nathaniel stood, his eyes locking onto his wife's. He saw the shift in her. The timid, overwhelmed girl who had endured 10 months of psychological torture was gone. In her place was a woman who had just realized she had the backing of the crown. Queen Genevieve stepped forward, leaving Beatrice's side, and began to walk slowly toward the head table. The rhythmic clicking of her heels on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb. The crowd parted for her, like the Red Sea. Billionaires averted their eyes. Politicians stared at their shoes. None of their wealth or influence meant a single thing in the face of absolute ancestral power. The queen stopped directly in front of the dais, looking up at Lady Eleanor, who was now clutching the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing. "Eleanor." Queen Genevieve said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. Your Majesty." Eleanor stammered, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. "Please, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The staff must have misdirected Beatrice. I would never—" Silence. The word was spoken softly, but it hit the room with the force of an artillery shell. Eleanor's jaw snapped shut. "Do not insult my intelligence by attempting to lie your way out of your own cruelty," the Queen commanded, her piercing blue eyes locking onto the matriarch. "I have just shared a bowl of potato soup at a dishwasher's table with a bride on her wedding day. I saw the seating arrangements, Eleanor. I saw the empty chair. I know exactly what you did, and more importantly, I know exactly why you did it." Queen Genevieve turned slightly, addressing the 500 elite guests who were hanging on to her every word. "You look at Beatrice Turner and you see a commoner," the Queen announced, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "You see dirt under her fingernails from her gardens. You see a lack of pedigree. You see someone you believe is beneath you." The Queen turned back to Eleanor, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "What you do not know, what none of you ignorant, self-important fools know, is that Beatrice is the daughter of Margaret Lynwood, and Margaret Lynwood was the woman who saved the crown. She was my confidant, my protector, and my dearest friend. The blood that runs through Beatrice's veins is braver, purer, and vastly superior to the toxic, venomous sludge that pumps through the heart of the Montgomery family." A collective, synchronized gasp rippled through the ballroom. Lord Rowan, Nathaniel's uncle, physically staggered back, horrified by the revelation. Penelope Wentworth let out a small squeak of terror. Beatrice wasn't a nobody. She was under the direct protection of the throne. Eleanor's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. She looked like a ghost. The social empire she had spent her entire life building, the terror she had instilled in her peers, was crumbling in a matter of seconds. "Your Majesty, Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest. "I didn't know. If I had known—" "If you had known, you would have treated her with the fake, sycophantic reverence you reserve for me," the Queen interrupted, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Your ignorance is not a defense, Eleanor. It is a revelation of your true character. You have mistaken cruelty for class. You have confused wealth with worth, and today you will pay the price for that confusion." The ballroom held its collective breath. The executioner's axe had been raised. Lady Eleanor Montgomery, the untouchable queen of high society, was about to be publicly dismantled. From this moment forward, Queen Genevieve proclaimed, her voice ringing out with terrifying finality. "The Montgomery family is utterly stripped of royal favor. Your invitations to all state functions are revoked. Your charities will no longer receive royal patronage. Anyone in this room who continues to associate, conduct business, or break bread with Lady Eleanor Montgomery will find themselves similarly excised from my circles." The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The aristocrats, billionaires, and shipping magnates in the room immediately took a physical step away from the head table. In the brutal, cutthroat world of the elite, royal disfavor was a death sentence. It meant plummeting stock prices, closed doors, and total social exile. Eleanor's closest friends, the women who had sipped tea and laughed at Beatrice's expense for months, now looked at Eleanor as if she were carrying the bubonic plague. Penelope Wentworth, realizing her own social standing was evaporating by proximity, tried to quietly slip out the side door. "Stop right there, Miss Wentworth," the Queen snapped without even looking at her. Penelope froze, a deer caught in the headlights. "I suggest you take a very long vacation. London has grown entirely too tired of your arrogance." Penelope burst into tears and fled the room, her designer heels echoing pitifully down the hallway. Eleanor fell to her knees. The grand, terrifying matriarch was reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the floor of her own ballroom. She looked past the Queen, her desperate eyes locking onto her son. "Nathaniel," Eleanor wailed, her voice cracking. "Nathaniel, please speak to Her Majesty. Tell her we are family. Protect your mother." Nathaniel walked forward, his hand firmly clutching Beatrice's. He looked down at the woman who had birthed him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hollow detachment. "You stopped being my mother the moment you sent my wife to the basement," Nathaniel said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I told you, Eleanor. I told you that if you pushed me I would leave, and you thought I was bluffing." Nathaniel turned to his uncle Lord Rowan, who was sweating profusely by the bar. "Uncle Rowan," Nathaniel barked, "call the board of directors. I am executing the release clause in the Montgomery Trust. I am pulling my entire share of the company, my liquid assets, and my controlling stake. As of Monday morning, my wealth is legally severed from this estate." Lord Rowan's jaw dropped. "Nathaniel, you can't be serious. That will bankrupt the family accounts. Highfield Manor will become exactly what it is," Nathaniel interrupted. "A massive empty mausoleum for a woman who loves power more than her own flesh and blood. Sell the estate, keep it. I don't care. I'm done." Eleanor let out a guttural scream. The money, the estate, the power. It was all vanishing in front of her eyes. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of Nathaniel's trousers, but a royal guard immediately stepped forward, blocking her path with a heavy-booted leg. "Oof, don't touch him," the guard warned darkly. Nathaniel turned his back on his mother. He looked at Beatrice, the fierce, incredible woman who had endured so much, and gently smoothed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked softly. Before Beatrice could answer, Queen Genevieve stepped between them, a warm, genuine smile finally returning to her face. "I have a better idea," the Queen said, her eyes sparkling with absolute triumph. "Beatrice, my dear, it appears your wedding reception has been severely compromised by poor management." The Queen cast one final, disdainful glance at Eleanor, who was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, entirely ignored by the 500 guests who were already whispering about the collapse of the Montgomery Empire. "I have instructed Lord Theodore to open the grand banqueting hall at the Royal Palace," Queen Genevieve announced. "I would be immensely honored if you and Nathaniel would allow me to host your reception tonight. Just true friends. No vipers allowed." Beatrice's eyes widened in sheer astonishment. She looked at Nathaniel, who gave her a brilliant, overjoyed smile and nodded enthusiastically. "Your Majesty," Beatrice whispered, tears of joy finally welling in her eyes, "we would be honored." "Excellent," the Queen declared. She turned and began walking toward the grand exit, her guards falling into formation behind her. "Come along then. We have a proper wedding feast to enjoy. And Chef Gerard." The Queen paused, looking over the heads of the crowd toward the service doors, where the massive French chef had quietly snuck up to watch the carnage, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Yes, Your Majesty," Chef Gerard replied, bowing deeply. "Pack up your knives," Queen Genevieve commanded. "I am firing you from this dismal estate. You work for the royal kitchens now. Bring the potato soup. It was phenomenal." Chef Gerard beamed, puffing out his chest. "At once, Your Majesty." With that, Queen Genevieve, Nathaniel, and Beatrice walked out of the ballroom, their heads held high, leaving the toxic wreckage of Highfield Manor behind them. Behind them, the 500 elite guests immediately began scrambling for the exits, practically trampling each other in their desperate rush to abandon the toxic fallout zone. Nobody looked at Lady Eleanor. Nobody offered her a hand. The mighty matriarch was left exactly where she belonged, entirely alone on the floor, surrounded by the shattered ruins of the empire she had destroyed with her own cruelty. The bride she had sent to the basement was currently in a royal motorcade headed for a palace, and as the last of the guests fled, leaving the massive ballroom deafeningly silent, Eleanor Montgomery finally understood the horrifying reality of her situation. She wasn't the queen of high society anymore. She was just a lonely, bitter woman in a white dress sitting in the ruins of an empty house. The contrast could not have been more staggering. Just an hour prior, Beatrice had been sitting on a splintered wooden stool surrounded by grease heat and the overwhelming scent of industrial dish soap. Now she was seated at the right hand of Queen Genevieve in the private dining room of the royal palace. The room was a masterpiece of 17th century architecture, lined with priceless tapestries and lit by a roaring fire that crackled warmly in the massive stone hearth. There were no billionaires here. There were no sneering aristocrats or judging heiresses. The guest list consisted solely of Beatrice, Nathaniel, the Queen Lord, Theodore Campbell, and a handful of the Queen's most trusted inner circle, who had been summoned from their private chambers at midnight to celebrate the union. Through the heavy double doors leading to the royal kitchens, the booming, joyous voice of Chef Girard echoed down the corridor. He had taken over the palace's culinary staff with the zeal of a conquering general, orchestrating a spontaneous, magnificent feast of roasted duck, truffled potatoes, and delicate spun sugar pastries. Nathaniel sat beside his wife, his hand resting firmly over hers. The anger that had nearly consumed him at Highfield Manor was beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He looked at Beatrice, whose face was illuminated by the golden candlelight, and felt a rush of absolute certainty. He had made the right choice. After the final course was cleared, Queen Genevieve gently tapped her crystal goblet with a silver spoon. The intimate room fell into a respectful silence. Beatrice, Nathaniel, the Queen, began, her voice rich with warmth. A wedding is a promise not just to each other, but to the future you will build together. And for too long the Montgomery family has built its future on the broken backs of those they deemed inferior. Tonight, that cycle ends. The Queen nodded to Lord Theodore, who stepped forward, carrying a heavy, ancient-looking mahogany box adorned with the royal crest. He placed it gently on the table in front of Beatrice. When your mother Margaret left the palace all those years ago to marry your father, Queen Genevieve explained softly, she refused to take a single penny of royal money. She wanted a life built on her own merit. However, I am not a woman who takes no for an answer. Unbeknownst to Margaret, I established a blind trust in her name. A trust that has been quietly compounding interest in the royal bank for nearly 30 years. Beatrice stared at the mahogany box, her heart hammering against her ribs. She carefully unlatched the brass clasp and opened the lid. Inside rested a stack of handwritten letters, bound in silk ribbon letters between her mother and the young Queen, and beneath them a thick dossier of legal documents stamped with the seal of Tobias Lockwood, the Crown's most ruthless and feared asset manager. This trust, the Queen continued, was legally bound to be transferred to Margaret's firstborn child upon the event of their marriage. That is you, Beatrice. You are not a commoner. Legally speaking, as of midnight tonight, you are the sole beneficiary of the Lynwood estate, a financial portfolio that easily rivals the Montgomery fortune. Nathaniel let out a low whistle of sheer disbelief. He looked at the paperwork, recognizing the astronomical figures printed on the summary page. And there is one final detail, the Queen said, her blue eyes flashing with a sudden, razor-sharp cunning. Eleanor Montgomery's social empire was built on a foundation of lies, but it was also built on lines of credit. For years, the Montgomery Corporation has been quietly borrowing massive sums from offshore holding companies to maintain their extravagant lifestyle and pay off their failing shipping ventures. Nathaniel nodded grimly. I knew the shipping division was bleeding cash, but my Uncle Rowan always handled the debt restructuring. He swore it was under control. It was, the Queen replied, a terrifying smile playing on her lips, because the anonymous holding company that purchased all of the Montgomery Corporation's debt was the Lynwood Trust, the trust I set up for your mother. The room went entirely silent. Beatrice looked at the Queen, her mind racing, as the monumental scale of the trap snapped into focus. Wait, Beatrice breathed, looking down at the legal documents. Are you saying? I am saying, my dear, Queen Genevieve said, leaning forward in her chair, that Lady Eleanor Montgomery does not own her empire. You do. The Montgomery estate, the yachts, the corporate tower, even Highfield Manor itself. They are all leveraged against loans held entirely by this trust. Loans that you, Beatrice, as the newly married beneficiary, now have the sole authority to call in. Nathaniel threw his head back and let out a bark of incredulous, triumphant laughter. The poetic justice of it was almost too beautiful to comprehend. The woman who had banished his wife to the basement was in reality living in a house owned by her. So, the Queen said, raising her glass of vintage champagne, what shall we do about the debt, Mrs. Montgomery? Beatrice looked at the paperwork. She thought of the cold, cruel halls of Highfield Manor. She thought of the 10 months of psychological torture, the insults, the sneers and the empty chair at her own wedding reception. A slow, determined fire ignited in her amber eyes. She picked up her champagne flute and clinked it against the Queen's glass. "I believe," Beatrice said, her voice steady and ringing with absolute authority, "that it is time to collect." Monday morning arrived in London, with a torrential downpour, the grey skies mirroring the bleak, terrifying reality that Lady Eleanor Montgomery was waking up to. She had spent the entire weekend locked inside the cavernous master suite of Highfield Manor, refusing to speak to the staff, furiously drinking gin and frantically dialing the private numbers of her most powerful allies. But the freeze-out was absolute. Lady Agatha Richmond, her closest confidant for 20 years, sent her calls directly to voicemail. Even the politicians whose campaigns Eleanor had funded refused to acknowledge her existence. The word of the Queen's wrath had spread through high society faster than a wildfire. But Eleanor still believed she had her money. She still believed that wealth could buy her a way out of the abyss. Dressing in a flawless, armored suit of black Chanel, Eleanor ordered her chauffeur to drive her to the Montgomery corporate tower in the financial district. If her son wanted to throw a tantrum and pull his assets, fine. She would restructure the board, liquidate the failing assets, and rebuild. She was a Montgomery. She did not break. She strode through the towering glass doors of the lobby, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. But the reception she received was not the usual terrified reverence. The security guards did not rush to open the elevator doors. The receptionist did not look up and smile. "Elevator, please," Eleanor barked at the front desk. The young receptionist swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Lady Eleanor. Your keycard has been deactivated. I have strict instructions from the top floor that you are to be escorted to the basement conference room." Eleanor's eyes widened in sheer outrage. "The basement? Do you know who I am? I own this building." "Not anymore, Eleanor." The voice echoed from across the lobby. Simon Gallagher, the chief financial officer of the Montgomery Corporation, was walking toward her, flanked by two heavily armed private security contractors and a man in a sharp, bespoke suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Tobias Lockwood, the Crown's attorney. "Simon, what is the meaning of this insolence?" Eleanor hissed, her hands trembling as the public humiliation began to unfold in the middle of the crowded lobby. "The board convened an emergency session at 6 a.m., Simon said coldly, adjusting his glasses. He looked at the woman he had feared for a decade and felt nothing but pity. "Nathaniel executed his release clause, effectively gutting our liquid capital. But that wasn't the killing blow. Mr. Lockwood here represents the primary debt holder of the Montgomery Corporation, and the debt holder has officially called in all outstanding loans. In full. Effective immediately." Eleanor scoffed, a desperate, hysterical sound. "That's impossible. The loans are structured over 30 years. No holding company would call them in without a reason." Tobias Lockwood stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with clinical precision. "The holding company is the Lynwood Trust, Lady Eleanor, and the primary beneficiary of that trust has exercised her legal right to demand immediate repayment, a right triggered by a breach of the trust's hostile action clause." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Lynwood. The name echoed in her mind. It was the maiden name the Queen had thrown in her face. It was Beatrice's mother's name. "Beatrice!" Eleanor whispered, the sheer horror of the realization making her knees buckle. "Beatrice owns the debt. Mrs. Montgomery holds the paper and everything you possess." Lockwood confirmed, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "Since the Montgomery Corporation does not have the £300 million in liquid assets required to settle the debt, the trust is seizing the collateral." Lockwood pulled a stack of legal documents from his briefcase and shoved them into Eleanor's trembling hands. "This is an eviction notice for Highfield Manor," Lockwood stated loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd of employees in the lobby could hear every word. "You have until 5 p.m. today to vacate the premises. You are permitted to take your personal clothing in one vehicle. The artwork, the jewelry, the estate, and the corporate holdings are now the legal property of Beatrice Montgomery." "No!" Eleanor screamed, the pristine mask of the aristocrat completely shattering. She grabbed Simon Gallagher's lapels, her manicured nails digging into his suit. "Simon, do something. You can't let a commoner take my family's legacy. Stop them." Simon firmly grabbed Eleanor's wrists and detached her from his suit, stepping back in disgust. "She isn't a commoner, Eleanor. She's the owner," Simon said coldly. He turned to the security guards. "Escort her off the premises. If she resists, call the police." Eleanor Montgomery, the terrifying matriarch who had ruled London's elite with an iron fist, was physically grabbed by the arms by two security guards and dragged backward toward the revolving glass doors. She screamed, she threatened, she wept, but nobody moved to help her. The employees watched in stunned silence as the architect of so much misery was unceremoniously thrown out onto the rain-slicked pavement of the financial district. She stood alone in the pouring rain, clutching an eviction notice, watching the corporate empire she had prized. Above her own son's happiness, lock its doors against her forever. 6 months later, the bitter chill of winter had given way to a brilliant, blooming spring. Highfield Manor, once a dark, oppressive fortress of exclusivity, had been completely transformed. Beatrice and Nathaniel had immediately stripped the estate of its cold, aristocratic pretension. They tore down the intimidating wrought iron gates. They opened the sprawling grounds to the public. The terrifying pristine lawns where Eleanor used to host her exclusive galas were now converted into a massive, thriving public botanical garden. It was named the Margaret Lynwood Botanical Foundation. It was a place of warmth, education, and life, dedicated to preserving rare plant species and offering free horticultural training to working-class youth. Beatrice stood in the center of the grand greenhouse wearing a simple linen apron over her dress, her hands covered in rich, dark soil. She was carefully repotting a delicate ghost orchid, humming softly to herself. She looked healthier, brighter, and completely at peace. Nathaniel walked into the greenhouse holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. He kissed his wife on the cheek, handing her a cup. "The Queen's motorcade is arriving in an hour for the ribbon-cutting ceremony." Nathaniel smiled, leaning against the wooden potting bench. "Chef Gerard is currently terrorizing the catering staff on the south lawn. He refuses to serve anything less than a 6-course meal for the public." Beatrice laughed, the sound bright and musical. "Let him. Today is a day for celebration." As they spoke, a young foundation assistant tentatively approached the greenhouse doors. "Excuse me, Mrs. Montgomery. There is a woman at the visitor's entrance. She bypassed the public gates and is demanding to speak with you." Security stopped her, but she claims she is family. Nathaniel's smile vanished instantly. His posture stiffened. "I'll handle this." "No," Beatrice said softly, wiping the dirt from her hands with a towel. "I'll go." Beatrice walked out of the greenhouse and across the vibrant, flower-lined pathways toward the main entrance. Standing near the ticket booth, flanked by 2 burly security guards, was Eleanor. The transformation was shocking. Eleanor was wearing a coat that was clearly 2 seasons old, slightly frayed at the cuffs. The heavy diamond necklaces and the aura of terrifying authority were entirely gone. She looked small, aged, and hollow. She had spent the last 6 months living in a cramped 2-bedroom flat in a dreary suburb, completely ostracized from society, living entirely off a meager monthly stipend that Nathaniel had authorized purely out of basic human pity. When Eleanor saw Beatrice approaching, a flicker of the old, arrogant fire danced in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the crushing weight of her reality. "Beatrice," Eleanor croaked, her voice devoid of its former venom. I need to speak with Nathaniel. The stipend he is providing is simply not enough. I cannot maintain my standard of living. The heating in that flat is abysmal. You must tell him to increase it. I am still his mother." Beatrice stopped a few feet away from Eleanor. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vengeful. She simply looked at the woman with a profound, impenetrable calmness. "Nathaniel is not taking visitors today," Beatrice said evenly. "And he handles all financial matters regarding your stipend through his lawyers. You know this, Eleanor." Eleanor's face flushed with a mixture of shame and desperation. "Please, Beatrice, look at what you have done to me. Look at what you have taken. This was my home. You have everything, the money, the palace connections, the power. Can you not show an ounce of the grace you pretend to have and allow me back into the family? Let me return to the manor. even if it's just to the guest wing. Beatrice looked out over the sprawling botanical gardens. She saw the working-class students laughing by the pond. She saw the vibrant life that had replaced the toxic, suffocating atmosphere Eleanor had curated for decades. Then, she looked back at the woman who had tried to destroy her on her wedding day. "Grace is for those who seek forgiveness." "Eleanor," Beatrice said quietly, her voice carrying the absolute unyielding authority of a true queen. "You do not want forgiveness. You just want your power back, and I will never let you have it." Eleanor's lip trembled. She took a step forward, dropping the aristocratic facade completely, her voice breaking into a pathetic plea. "Beatrice, please. I have nowhere else to go. I am eating microwave dinners in a kitchen the size of a closet. Where am I supposed to sit?" Beatrice looked at her mother-in-law, the memory of that gray, bitterly cold wedding day flashing in her mind. The humiliation, the grease-stained tiles, the empty chair at the head table. Beatrice offered Eleanor a tiny chilling smile. "I ate my wedding meal in the basement." "Eleanor," Beatrice whispered the finality of her words, slicing through the spring air like a blade. "There is no seat for you at my table. Not today, not ever. Guard, please escort this woman off the property." Beatrice turned her back on Eleanor and walked away, heading back toward the greenhouse, back toward her husband, and back toward the beautiful, thriving world she had built from the dirt up. Behind her, Lady Eleanor Montgomery was escorted out of the gates, left to wander the unforgiving streets of a city that had completely forgotten her name. The queen of high society was dead. The botanist and the prince had won. And that is the ultimate masterclass in wedding day karma. Eleanor thought she was breaking a commoner, but she ended up handing the keys to her entire empire to the very woman she tried to destroy. From the basement kitchens to owning the actual estate, Beatrice delivered the coldest, most satisfying revenge in history. What did you think of the queen's epic midnight twist? Would you have shown Eleanor mercy, or did she get exactly what she deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a glorious revenge story, and hit that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping real-life drama.